This episode of What the Force is sponsored by Super Yaki. Check out their amazing movie-inspired merch at superyaki.com. Welcome, everyone, to What the Force, and welcome to a deep dive discussion into the death of the author. And joining me for this discussion is Gina Sanders. Welcome.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
When we first had you on the show, we talked about, communication theory, and we talked about Marshall McLuhan and kind of how communication is very much dependent on both the person that is communicating their intention and the person receiving that communication. And the truth lies somewhere in the middle. We talked a little bit about that in addition to the theories of Marshall McLuhan and how that relates to the big multimedia storytelling of Star Wars. This is very Star Wars in the meta. But when we had that initial discussion, we talked about, what are some of the cool topics that we could take on next? And you mentioned Death of the Author, which I had never heard of before, which is a essay that was written in, I believe, 1963 by Roland Barthes. And he's a French literary critic who, was engaged in conversations about literary theory and was really kind of trying to push people away from the structuralist approach. And we can go into a brief description of what structuralism is from a thought perspective. But this was really the tipping point in thought towards a post-structuralist conversation of fiction and literary criticism.
Mm-hmm.
You studied this actually from a communications perspective.
Yeah, so I was first introduced to this essay and to this author actually in my pro seminar class, which is an interesting story in itself because I started graduate school in January and most people start in August. And my pro seminar class is in August, and it's essentially the class that teaches you how to do grad school. And I was taking it a semester and a summer after I had already been through grad school, but I still needed it. It taught me a lot of things that I needed to know, a lot of things I still need to know, but I have forgotten. But one of the things I did not forget was the death of the author, particularly because I wanted to apply it to all of my own interests and hobbies, and not just Star Wars, but everything. I was like, okay, who is writing this? What are they saying? Why? Does it matter? Am I going to agree, with what Roland Barthes is saying? And so I was really, when we were talking about what else to talk about, I was like, I wonder how she feels about this.
I think it's a super interesting conversation to have.
Yeah. Which we were talking a little bit beforehand, and I was letting you know that my opinions about this has flip-flopped, they have evolved, they've regressed a little bit. So, someone could be listening to this like so many years in the future, and maybe I have added something to it and maybe it's changed. But one of the things I think is so interesting is when we had to first suggest this, I was like, who cares what the author has to say? Who cares about their background? Whatever. I get to determine me, because that's very much how I approach community. And we talked a little bit about this in the last episode I was on, because I'm very much, it doesn't matter what the author's intention is, me as the reader, as the audience who's taking in your message, how I interpret it is what's important. That's how I approach communication. And so that's how I was feeling about this. I was like, doesn't matter what the author intended or where they're writing from. And then since I've dialed back on that like a whole bunch, and I'm just like, well, okay, well, the author has some points, as a creator. And so rereading his essay, I've been like, okay, my opinion's still there a little bit, but it's more in line with what I think he's actually saying.
All right. So what is this essay, and why does it have such a clickbaity name? Because it does. It has the most clickbaity name. Death of the author. Like,
if anyone who is listening would like to find this essay, it's actually super accessible. If you just put into Google Scholar, Roland Barthes, The Death of the Author, you can find
and his last name is
link.
French, and so it's spelled Barthes.
Which is also where I say thank you for telling me how, like, people have pronounced it obviously in class, but like I'm not a French speaker, so thank you for that. And then also Wikipedia is also a thing. So if you hear me talking, you're like, oh, and some of those points sound really familiar.
It's a very short
also
essay.
Wikipedia.
It's only 7 pages long. So
that is also true.
And it is referring to another piece of work that he's talking about and kind of replying to. And it was in a set of essays that he wrote and published on his own, but people pull this one out because it really did spark conversation and reply, and I don't know, a lot of thought around what he said sparked off of it. And there are people that take this essay very literally, like, yes, the author doesn't matter, hyperbole wins, but I think that what is important out of it, we're going to get into kind of the points that he makes and what's important to consider, and then how that applies to Star Wars specifically. But I think what's really important is that, much like how Rian Johnson or George Lucas would say, if it sparks conversation and it sparks reaction and it sparks people to think about things in a different way, that's what's important about it. It gives you a lens by which to say, oh, hey, maybe I have been, looking at what the author intended as gospel truth. And really, maybe it's a balance of the two things. My intention and how I read the work, understanding my own biases, and also understanding what the author intended, but also digging into the symbolic meaning that is inherent in everything. It'll be an interesting conversation, Gina. I'm super excited.
So I think when a lot of people hear that title, they immediately jump to the conclusion I originally did when I first was introduced to this essay in class, and that would be that the author does not matter at all. And author being, at least in the way I believe we're going to talk about it in this episode, in this podcast, the author of a book, the author of the television series, the author of the movie, the one who creates.
The creator of the work. Yes.
Yes, the creator of the work. So I think when you hear that, what might jump into your mind is that person does not matter at all. They wrote a thing, and then they're immediately divorced from that thing. And I think that's how I originally took it before doing some work into it. And that's not what he means, like, at all. Really what he means, actually, there's a really good metaphor, this idea of like textiles and fabric. And so there's this quote I wrote down that says, a text is a tissue or fabric of quotations drawn from innumerable centers of culture. So essentially, it's this idea that we take a little bit from all of these different points and these different places in order to create and craft our text. And we also cannot precisely pinpoint exactly or detect what the writer intended. Yeah. So we as an audience cannot specifically be like, this is exactly what they intended, especially because they pull from so much. And so I think what he really wants us to acknowledge is that a lot of things come in to influence what we are creating. Mm-hmm. And I'm even going to say that some stuff we may not realize is influencing. And so when we go to decipher this thing that has been created by the creator, and we go to create meaning from it, well, there's a lot there to unpack.
Yeah. And, we might not know or even what the author says they intended might not be the truth. It could be an edited version of even their own thought structure when they were writing, or they might not have consciously been aware of what they were plugging into. And so it's very hard for us to fully analyze intention and results.
Yes. To back up a little bit, we're not saying that all of those other intentions aren't important. Mm-hmm. They come from someplace. And in fact, it's that very fact that made me change the way that I read and I saw this essay, especially when I thought of things like own voices and telling your own story and being influenced by, personal things that happen in one's life in order to craft a story. So another line that helped me grapple with this and then come to terms with it is that your text is the number one source of meaning. It's like your primary source. And then the author's desires and their intent, that's secondary. So we're not saying it's not important. We're just saying the text as itself is what we're looking at first.
Yeah. And so if we were to take this into like the Star Wars universe and talk about different things, there are like deleted scenes or behind the scenes cutouts, or we heard something had happened on set, or even to the concept art, right? There was a period of time when the Oracle was part of the story in The Rise of Skywalker, and now that is not part of the text. And so we have to take the text as it is, as it currently exists, regardless of maybe what was originally intended and couldn't be fit in. The thing that ended up being, put together is very important. There's going to be an additional caveat I have to do with that in a future part of the conversation, to do with either re-releases or extended editions. And the complexity of the fact that we live in a Star Wars is one story adds to the complexity, because every time that the story iterates because of future knowledge that we understand, and we can talk about the original trilogy and the prequels in addition to that, it complicates the conversation, because everybody's own experience of the text will be different.
If you want to talk about re-releases and things like that, I could even see a portion of listeners who are thinking, okay, but what about canon?
Yeah.
What about things that used to be canon and they're not canon? Or what about things like, free makers, things that like seem like they're in line and they're not a part of like what were considered like gospel. And so it gets into this whole, which I also would like to preface and say that if you're into legends, or things like that, we're not saying it's bad. We're not saying you don't count.
No.
Not at all. But it's part of the conversation of saying, I think really the last episode I was in, with Marshall McLuhan, and this one now, really all I want to talk about is who gets to create meaning and things, who gets to decide what has meaning, and how are we going to interact with that?
Yeah.
And so really that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, especially with tweets from Matt Martin, who is a lovely cinnamon bun, by the way, who's like, people take canon too seriously. It's like, okay, Matt. but in truth, like, it is important to understand that everybody's Star Wars is going to be super unique because it's from their own perspective. And I want to acknowledge that the complexity of having Star Wars be one story actually adds complexity to this conversation, but we can get into that after we get kind of down a more simplified path. Imagine we have one text. Like, let's talk about original New Hope, maybe.
Okay.
We'll start there, because I think that once we add like more layers to this, it makes it more complex, and understanding that it's so complex maybe makes you a little bit more patient with the fact that everybody has their own opinion about Star Wars.
Okay, works for me.
Okay. Let's walk through some of the points that he was trying to make in his essay.
Right.
He was in response to really trying to understand, who gets to decipher the meaning of what was intended. That's kind of how he starts out. And he starts out with this example of a character kind of thinks something, third person omniscient in their head in the text that he is responding to. And he's like, who's saying this? Is it the author? Yeah. Is it like, he refers to...
is it the narrator?
Is it the narrator? He refers to these...
universal wisdom.
Yeah, these pieces as cultural texts. So they are saying something that is kind of entered into cultural public record in a way. And he's like, is it the character? Is it the author? Is it the narrator? Like, is it an unreliable narrator, so we can't even necessarily trust that it's the character, or really what the truth is in the text? Like, there's a lot of that conversation and questioning, what is he supposed to get out of this? And he starts to question whether, like, the role of authors, especially in modern society, as almost I think he refers to them almost like gods of creation. And like, like he's saying that in modern society, kind of from like the 1900s on, we have separated the role of author as somebody who not just is kind of speaking for the cultural zeitgeist of the time,
right?
But as somebody who is held apart and above, and is almost like a genius of creation.
Yeah.
And he struggles with this because if you kind of follow those logical steps, it makes the author, every work or every piece of art that they create, as not a cultural reflection, but as a window into that creator's psyche. So, and he uses the example of Van Gogh and how everybody knew about Van Gogh's madness, or, the fact that he had, struggles with depression and struggles with, like creative depression.
Yeah.
And they view all of his work through that lens, rather than, somewhere closer to the truth, which is, what he saw from society and reflecting that into the world through a creative lens.
Things that I wrote down as I was rereading this essay is a line of his, and it says, "The explanation of work is always sought in the man or the woman who produced it." And this idea of the sway of the author being so powerful, but we're attempting to distance that a little, kind of lessen that power. And so I really, really like how you phrase. I think you did a fantastic job of working through that and phrasing that, because oftentimes, and we still do it today, even with most things, we go immediately to the person who created it and we go, well, what did you mean? What did you intend? And whatever explanation they give, we say, oh, that is the meaning behind this. That is the intention. And it's only, I think, when we as an audience don't agree with that vision, which I think happens all the time in Star Wars, do we think, oh, well, are you sure it's this, thing?
Yeah.
And so that's when we start to see some of that distance. That's where we start to see a little bit of that power lesson. But if we're always either so beholden to the creator where we go, no matter what, this is what it means, or if we're always on the same track as them, we're going to continue to feed in that. And Roland's like, no, stop that.
Yeah, exactly. And I can give a couple of examples of both positive and negative associated with this. Like from my own experience and like things that I have struggled with personally from a creation perspective with Star Wars. Rian Johnson and the brilliance that he brought to the screen is not an exclusion of Rian Johnson, right? Like, he acknowledges where he came up with ideas, but also the cultural like pieces that he's tapping into and are coming forth, things that he maybe didn't necessarily intend, come through the work anyways, right? And if you see meaning in that maybe he didn't intend, but came through anyways, that's okay. That's okay that you saw something else. Even though, we love what he has to say and we love how he thinks about the work. For me, Charles Soule created the Vader, 2015 or 2017 run where Vader is doing this meditation thing and he's in his own little world and there's these little blue, looks like butterflies floating around him. And a lot of people around me and in my fandom were like, oh my God, that's blue butterflies. That stands for Padme. Because there is a symbolic relationship in Star Wars with her wearing butterflies and literally her costuming looking butterfly-like in many scenes in the prequels. And then there was also a tie to the rollout Ben Solo shorts, where Ben, as a Rolo ball that looks like BB-8, has some adventures, and so he works with a cloud of blue butterflies, basically. And so Ben has been associated with those blue butterflies. Padme has been associated with those blue butterflies. But what Charles Soule intended was annoying light side fireflies. Does that mean that our intention to see that, or that what they looked like or what they represented to us was wrong? No.
Not at all.
No. And actually, like when I told Charles that, he was cool with that interpretation. He just, that wasn't his intention. He was thinking of the most annoying bug to Vader. Yeah. And we thought it meant, yes, an annoying bug, but an annoying bug with like force-like meaning behind it. And both are actually fairly powerful. It's cool though.
It is. So I want to, the way we're kind of going a little bit, which we can abandon this if it doesn't end up working out, but we talked a little bit about his words, and then you have this really, really cool real world recent example, and then I want to like sandwich it again with some text, especially because I was just flipping through the essay again. I'm like, oh my goodness, exactly what she's talking about right here. Yeah. And so this line says, and it's like around page 4, if anyone's like, which is going to be so cool if someone just goes and reads this essay, because like you said, it's not super long, but it says, we know that a text does not consist of a line of words releasing a single theological meaning, the message of the author God, but is a space of many dimensions in which we are wedded and contests various kinds of writings, no one of which is original. The text is a tissue. That's kind of what we were talking about a little bit earlier with the fabric of citations resulting from the 1,000 sources of culture. And so like, as you're talking about that example, I'm just like, that's the tissue of because you have these ideas of, the rollout and Ben Solo, and you have these ideas of Padme, and that's not what he was intending, but you can't ignore that a meaning something comes from. It's just one of the pieces of tissue that comes together.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And in a way, like you think about the art of laminating, right? Laminating being that it's different layers of like lighter material glued together. That is Star Wars. Like everybody has their own laminated Star Wars out there where they've had different tissues or different thin pieces of text that they have pasted together. And that is their like stronger meaning that they pull from the work. And some layers might be thicker than others, but it's all together in that meaning.
A personal example for me is I've been talking a lot with Yoda Bauer, Port Haven Forum's Jess, about this, because she's someone who really enjoyed The Rise of Skywalker, and I personally did not. And so we've been having these different conversations of, okay, what did you see? And, why did you like this? And I would say, what did I see? And why did I feel like this failed me or fell short in some kind of way? And so it's been really, really nice to have, and it not be like no one's mean to each other. We like understand where everyone comes. And so it's been really nice to have like these adult conversations. But one of the things that we discussed is, she is a fan. We're both fans of, the saga and the franchise as a whole. But the Star Wars that she grew up with was the prequels. And she remembers, watching the original trilogy as a kid and going to see the prequels in the theater, And so when, Disney announced that they had bought Lucasfilm and we were coming up with more movies, she was ready for it. She was excited for it. And then you have me, who knew about Star Wars as a kid, could not care less, and then got into it because of The Force Awakens. And so just by the fact of our entry points into this franchise immediately already changed the way that we viewed specific things. But and I'm like, this is my inner nerd coming out, because it's something I didn't even realize until I talked to her, because and I think I've at least mentioned this on Twitter before, and I think I might have mentioned it in our last episode. But when I came into Star Wars, I watched the TV spot and I saw Kylo Ren and I said, "Who are you? You matter to me." And so when I went and I checked out all the DVDs of the prequels and the original, I had heard all the rumors of which movie is good, and I believed them until I actually watched them. And I was like, none of you know what you're talking about. The prequels are amazing. But when I watched it, I watched it with the intention of the eye of, there's this person I'm going to get to know in December with a mask. I'm watching these other movies so I can understand, like, just in case someone's related to you, or I can understand what your motivations are, like what you're building from. So when I came into the sequel trilogy, I watched all this beforehand material to say, this is going to build up this character somehow. How does it affect this one character? And granted, like, I love everyone else. I appreciate and I treasure everyone else. But until I talked to Jess, I had no idea that that's the lens and the frame that I was coming from. And so when certain things happened, I was either more elated or more sad, because I was literally relating everything around this one character of Kylo Ren and Ben Solo. And so just that idea of, this is the lens that I'm coming from. And so I'm making different meanings out of this line, out of this theory, I'm reading this scene this way, because I'm saying it's going to affect this, like, through line of characters, which isn't wrong and it's not bad. It's just different. And it's how I'm creating this specific amount of meaning and pulling from, this is what I know about this culture. So that's why I'm going to predict that after, The Force Awakens, this is going to happen in The Last Jedi. And after The Last Jedi, this is how I'm predicting that this is what's going to happen in The Rise of Skywalker. I wasn't always right. On some things I was, but I was reading every single cultural line and saying, I know this from this. Which is what speculation is, which I think everyone who was listening to all the speculation episodes and podcasts were like, I'm with you, which is why some of us were like, me, was sobbing really hard after the Rise of Skywalker.
And I want to say, like, it's important to acknowledge your own angle by which you're looking through the lens. I think that that's really, really important. And so I do think that how sometimes it feels like the sequel trilogy is ignored by the larger official materials, or maybe it's not treated the same way, does feel like a disconnect to the fans who are pulling meaning in on them on their own perspective. And that's where we get a lot of the disconnect. It's like, what are the creators intending and creating more of? And what are the audience reading? Or at least the audience that were like killer fans of certain dynamics or certain pieces of the sequel trilogy specifically. And what are they taking in? Because I don't think that, like me being a fan since I, like existed, I don't think that my fandom is any less or greater than anybody else's. And I think that that's really an important and healthy stance to take. My inherent readership and value is not better than anyone else's. We don't always get that, though. There are people out there in the world that are like, no, my opinion is the only one that matters. And I think that it's just really important to acknowledge that other people will have unique experiences and unique lenses by which to view the saga and the story.
Exactly.
Now, a word from our sponsor. Do you love movies? The good ones? Even the bad ones everyone told you not to like? It sounds like Super Yaki is the place for you. The team at Super Yaki loves movies, so much so that they've dedicated every waking moment of their life to bring you top quality merchandise to showcase your love of them. From super soft t-shirts advocating for the immediate production of a third national treasure, to comfy sweatshirts celebrating Rian Johnson's triumphant whodunit Knives Out. They even have pins of some of your favorite directors like Sofia Coppola and Jordan Peele. Super Yaki joyously brings you tangible love letters to movies and filmmakers that you can wear with pride. Plus, the team at Super Yaki screen prints all of their apparel using eco-friendly 100% water-based inks and ships with compostable poly mailers for an environmentally friendly alternative to online shopping. And as a special gift to you, listeners can save 10% on their order with the code SUPERFRIEND, all caps, no spaces, at checkout. If the spirit moves you, find them at SUPERYAKI.com. Let's watch more movies. And we're back. What's the next point you want to cover here?
Just the idea that one reading isn't like above, one or the other, because we opened up with this idea of, who is saying these things? Is it the narrator? Is it the reader? Is it this universal wisdom, etc.? I wanted to bring in this other line that's towards the end of the essay, where it says, so we're returning to this beginning, and it says, no one, that is no person, utters it. Its source, its voice, that's us trying to figure out who's talking, is not to be located, and yet it is perfectly read. This is because the true locus of writing is reading. And so I wanted to take that idea real fast and just kind of make that connection. I like circles.
Absolutely.
And just be able to say, it's that, once again, we ask this question, we don't know the answer. Are we ever going to know the answer? But you as the reader and you as the audience can be able to still decipher and make meaning out of various texts.
Yes. So I do want to take a step sideways and talk about how he brings up the historical role of author in society. And like he actually refers to it back in sort of even Greek and Roman times, when the authors of a work were actually pulling from well-known folklorish stories Like stories that were either commonly known or passed by word of mouth. And then those people who would write them for dramatic presentation to society were just kind of formalizing them to be turned into mass viewing.
Right.
And
yes.
From a certain point of view, that is what Star Wars is doing, right?
Yes.
These authors are very well aware, these authors and creators are very well aware of the code of writing. Like, how does a story need to be put together to become a story? How does a story need to be put together to make it a story that speaks to the hero's journey, which is not something Joseph Campbell created. It is just something that exists from a structuralist perspective. And, George Lucas himself is like a collage creator, and that plugs into what Roland Barthes is saying. He is saying, these inspirations and these things that exist in other cultural texts and in our brains because we exist in society and relate to other humans, if you pull them together and you cut them into pieces and you rearrange them into a story, the author is almost like, what did he referred them to? He would prefer them to be called like scripters rather than authors. Because the idea is that you're speaking for the culture when you're creating a piece of art. You're speaking for society and you're speaking for the culture. You're not just speaking from a place of independent brilliance. And Lucas, on top of that, is also pulling together all of the creative works of all of the people working on the films together, because we're just talking about A New Hope here, just like even just Star Wars without A New Hope attached. It was just Star Wars at the time.
Just Star Wars.
Just Star Wars. But even then he was pulling together, the work of Ralph McQuarrie to influence him. And Ralph McQuarrie was influenced by Metropolis to create C-3PO, and he's working with all the creature and concept workers who were all influenced by different pieces of cultural work. And he is working with, the costume designers, and he himself was influenced by the work of Akira Kurosawa, the work of John Ford, his own experience and the experience of working with other creators. So he is, as director and writer, pulling in all of these different threads and almost weaving the textile tapestry rather than creating it from scratch. And that's the point that Roland Barthes tries to get to kind of mid-essay, is that, like, it's really important to acknowledge the fact that this person exists in society and is not a separate from it. Like, he would refer to this person in a different time and age as like a shaman or a speaker for the cultural unconscious in a way.
Well, and I love that you bring up the fact that he refers to this individual as the scriptor, because one of the things that I noted is, as I was reading, was he says that they exist to produce, but not explain the work. And as you broke down, all of those levels of influence on Star Wars, just A New Hope, so George Lucas, has done plenty of interviews where he's talked about, different influences, etc. But if you take literally only just what you said, and this just got like my wheels turning, so I would love all the feedback you got. But if you only took George Lucas as this scripter, as this creator and author, and you wanted to derive meaning from Star Wars, and so we're starting at this point where we think, the creator is the one who has meaning. We're starting there at the very beginning of the essay before we, dive into what that means for the work. And you ask him, what is the meaning of Star Wars? Wars? What is the meaning of A New Hope? And he can have an answer for you. We're not saying he doesn't have an answer. But then when you start to think of, all these individuals you just listed who were influenced by other pieces of work, who contributed to the creation of Star Wars, and then they have their meanings and influences. So you actually start digging into the layers of this tapestry, and then you go all the way back to then when you go, so once you go through all those different individuals and what they were influenced by and what their goal was, etc., when you take all of those answers and then you go back to originally what George Lucas says, I think you're going to find something maybe a little different, or you're going to find something that doesn't quite match up. And part of that could go through intent, because when maybe George Lucas, didn't fully understand or get what someone else, he came up with another, I shouldn't say didn't fully understand, because once again, we make our own meaning, but, maybe he derived meaning from something, an influence that wasn't what they originally intended, etc. And so I think that I'm 100% on the same page with you, where if we actually start to pull back each of these layers and look at different things, you can't just ask this one person, what did you mean? Because it's 1,000 different things.
Yeah. And if we were to shift and look at and this is my experience with working and interviewing authors, is hey, what did you mean when you did this? And you might get an answer, but it might not necessarily be 100% of the truth, or it might not necessarily be entirely what they intended, and they plugged into something that was part of, the cultural text, right? Because that's something that Roland Barthes really gets into, which is to say the text, even though, it exists because of the author, doesn't exist only the way that the author intended. Just repeating that message.
Right. And I love the use of this word culture. So I only want to shift the teensiest bit to this idea of semiotics.
Yay!
Just like the teensiest bit.
It's like,
oh, were you waiting?
I was like, when is Judy gonna bring this as? No, this is my jam.
I think my ultimate nerd moment is, so in one of my classes, I took a feminist media studies class. It was actually one of the first classes I ever took in grad school. And it's because, believe it or not, how old was I when I started grad school? I'm 23 now. So I think I was 22, about to turn 23. And so I'm a child. I'm a literal baby. But actually, up until then, feminism was a dirty word for me. And the fact that I believe, in this idea of equity and equality, but it had been associated with and I think this is actually a really common view, it had been associated with so many negative things. And so I decided to take this class because I was like, I know this can't be what it is. Mm-hmm. But someone teach me about the ways. Someone teach me what this is. And then what does that mean for, intersectionality and what does it mean for all of these things, especially for me as a Black woman? And that's a tangent. But I bring it up to say that in that class, we touched a little bit on semiotics because we would do these analysis of different advertisements and that were sexist, and like what they were saying about women and the culture surrounding, and it's American advertisements, the culture surrounding women and what was believed. And so I did all these analysis, and then I was like, wait a minute, this is my jam. So when we were talking about this and you were like, I was like, I love a good semiotic analysis. And you were like, okay, but me too. I was like, nerd.
Yeah.
Nerd out moment.
Just as a total tangent, I think I took a very similar class, but it was from a psychology perspective, women studies in psychology. And specifically, they focused on woman in the refrigerator in advertisements. And so like showing women either murdered or killed in advertisements, mm-hmm. especially during the 1970s, 1980s. It was a massive thing where like literally like they would sell like different things to males specifically with women who were literally murdered like a woman in a garbage can upside down, and like it was selling something to a man.
Very much. Oh my goodness, very much violence and like trigger warning. And
yeah, but like that was like standard
this
advertising for the period of time, and like it was just. It was very shocking, and like you would have a trigger warning on that class like nowadays, but there wasn't anything like that when I was in school.
And you would think that I shouldn't be shocked right now considering everything that's happening in the world, and yet I can't believe that's used to sell products. I also want to take this class. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's just, you know, and it is something that came up recently because of Bounty Hunters #4 and the use of that trope in the comic book, and that like we need to question those things when they come up, because it's actually literally like a very 1980s like mindset, and it's like, what were you trying to plug into? What was your meaning? But also it kind of doesn't matter what your meaning was. To this point, it's what we as the reader read into that and understand out of that.
Which I think, so I did not read this comic, and we can go back to our semiotics vein in a second. So I did not read this comic. I saw a lot of people's outrage on Twitter, and then someone tweeted a panel, and I was like, this is justified. Why are you doing this? And so of course I saw individuals, you know, pushing back against, you know, it's Bounty Hunter. It's who, I don't know who it was, like Boba Fett or someone.
Yeah. So there was, there was two sort of violence against women scenarios. One, it's just more of a threat of violence against a pregnant woman. And then there was an outright like shot from surprise, basically, by Boba Fett to this one bounty hunter who was like she talked about her wife the whole time. We empathized with her. She was a queer woman of color. She wanted to get out of the game. She didn't know why she was there. It was like it was basically the I'm 2 days from retirement conversation the whole time. And then like Boba Fett shows up and like straight up like kills her, or at least we assume she's dead because of how she looks at the end of the thing. Yeah. It's like that's the last panel of the whole thing, and Boba Fett is like, I've been looking for a long time to kill this blah blah blah. It's like, yeah, and how he's standing is very like macho big, and like, you know, it just reads bad.
Yeah, catch me with these diet flashbacks. I'm just like, oh, we didn't learn the first time. But the thing that I wanted to pull from that is this whole time we've been talking about who gets to control a narrative, how we make meaning, you know, and that's kind of where we're going to get into this idea of semiotics. And one of the things that I learned from my feminist media studies class is that we all can have our worldviews, and we all come from different like areas of culture that shapes how we see things. We have societal norms, we have societal values, we have expectations, and there are big things that basically, you know, everyone should probably agree with. Not looking at the nuance of it for a second, just the idea that murder is bad. I think most people would agree with that simple blanket statement, just written down, murder is bad. And then, of course, you can have conversation about situations, et cetera, that people are having every day, no matter what, about, you know, what counts as that, the situations, et cetera. But I think we can all agree that. And so one of the things that changed how I had those conversations is during that class and my African-American rhetoric class and all these different classes, when you acknowledge that there's systematic racism, and we have systematic sexism, and we have the patriarchy, which I know that's like a buzzword for some people. Are like, oh, we're just going to turn it off, just talking about this. But when our country is literally founded on these things, and it leads into and it's woven into the very fabric of our laws, and that's what our societal norms and expectations are built on, that's where you get the individuals who are like, there's war in the title of this. Everything, it's going to be violent. It's a bounty hunter. But when you step back and you go, but we're better than this. We understand that this, whether the author intended, because I don't know who this author is. I don't want to, put words into their mouth, whether they've responded or not. But when I, as a reader, and who I've already established, I'm the one who creates meaning. It's me who gets to decide and interpret. When I, as a reader, understand that we are every day influenced by these different values and these different codes that are every day telling me I'm less than because I'm a Black woman, and it's telling me that other individuals are more than me. And then you take that mindset, whether you intend to or not, and you write, you're further like cementing these values and these different codes, and you're creating more signs and you're creating more meanings, which is why I can say, yeah, violence is a thing that's in this universe, but look at proportionately how many of your women, how many of your Black women, your brown women, your queer women, how many exist, and then how many are killed, and then how many are treated violently in comparison to the entirety of the saga and all the other characters that exist. And then I can go, there's your problem. But it's only after I've accepted all of these other layers and created all of these other meanings and said, this sign right now is telling me that brown or people of color or Black queer women do not matter. It's not just violence in a thing. It's telling me something. I'm reading something from that. And then I can have this conversation with you and others who I'm just like, and that's why it matters.
Yeah.
That's why it's not just a comic. That's why it's not just violent. And so I just went on a tangent, but
no, it was great. And that's why I like literally just like was so frustrated when this Bounty Hunters #4 came out, because I've been keeping up with the plot of it and like the highlights of it, even though after the first comic number, the first book was released, the first comic was released, I decided to not subscribe anymore. Like I pick them up physically because I want to support my local comic shop, etc. And I'm still subscribed to other comics, etc. I'm still supporting the comic shop, but I viewed it as violence porn in many ways, because the plot was low and the violence was heavy, and it was like violence for the sake of violence. And so I didn't decide to subscribe anymore, but I kept up with the plot because I feel like that's very important to understand, like, hey, where are they going with these things? We don't have any Black women in the writer's room. I can tell you that. I know that. We don't have any sensitivity readers in the writer's room. We don't have anybody who has a voice in the creation process. So this is our only way to give feedback, is like, look, I don't know what you intended. I actually don't even care right now, because this is how this ended up looking to everybody. And regardless of the privilege of being a white man in North America, and what that means is that you don't see that being that story. I'm sorry, but this is what it means to the queer women of color that literally read this comic and were like, WTF Star Wars.
Yeah.
You gave me a queer woman of color who literally tells us her life story, the whole comic, and you kill her in the last panel. How dare you?
Exactly. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And I didn't mean to do this side tangent, but I think that it's actually very apropos, because regardless of the fact that, the author or the writer who is Ethan Sachs, who like seems like a good enough dude, like it still didn't see that as a problem. And that's part of the problem, is like, you wrote this story, you didn't see it as a problem, but you're influenced by cultural things that are around you. I don't know what to say other than that's the story that you ended up telling, regardless of your intention.
Yeah. And I, parts of this have the keywords that we've been saying, but even still, I thank you for the space to go off on this tangent, because it's something that I will never shut up about. And it's something that I will scream about to the high heavens, just how wrong this is. And then, there's two different avenues where it's, you have authors who fully understand what they're doing, and they do it anyway. And there's a level of correction that needs to be taken to that. And then you have authors who do not understand. And that's where, as tired as I am, I just want to be like, okay, I guess I gotta educate you. Because,
like, just to pause there, it shouldn't just be you that is outraged by this. And I really love Brad Wimple, especially. Like, he had to go in private and deactivate his account because the Fundamentalists literally came after him associated with this his comments.
He deserves significantly better.
Yeah.
Significantly
and
better.
People standing up for this literally gets this public censure from people on the internet, where they literally bombard public fans with threats of violence. That shouldn't be the fandom that we exist in. And so anybody that feels like they need a safe space within fandom where they can be free of all of that is absolutely I absolutely advocate for. And again, if you're a woman, Galactic Fempire on Facebook, safe space. You can talk about anything to do with Star Wars, and they're very well moderated, etc. And I have a Discord, of course, where I moderate the hell out of that because I want to provide safe spaces for fans where they can just discuss things and not feel like they're going to be threatened with violence.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Kudos on those safe spaces. Kudos to you. I'm literally over here trying not to cry.
Well, I'm so sorry, Gina.
No, it's okay.
But that's part of the fandom that we live in. And we love Star Wars so much that we're willing to put up with it, but it shouldn't be that way. It shouldn't be a place that evokes this sort of thing. And if that's the message that Star Wars is producing, even unintentionally, they really need to take a step back and look at what they're producing and have a good heart-to-heart with themselves.
I completely agree. It's this whole conversation of, who gets to create meaning, who gets to craft these things. And yet I think we can all agree that George Lucas has these intentions. Ryan has these intentions. Dave, JJ, all these people have these intentions about what they want to create. And then we as the fans, interpret it, get to see this meaning. But I would like to think, and this is not true, but I would like to think that no matter what pieces we're all pulling from, at the end of the day, we want to say, we want a good story. We want a hopeful story. We want something that's for everyone. And obviously that's not really true, but I think that's all what we want and a motivation behind what we want. And so I think that's a common ground. And
if you're creating a story that doesn't start out with the intention to create hope, I think that you're starting from a wrong place with Star Wars. I'm just going to say that. If you're not trying to create hope, you're actually missing the point.
Which, and it sucks that I even have to, my brain even goes, down these paths, but immediately after you said that, which it's something I very much agree with. This is turning into therapy as much as I agree
love you,
with
Gina.
that.
It's okay.
Thank you. I love you. I immediately, I just, I heard Sky Talkers and this idea of, this darker middle chapter and this idea of tragedy. And I'm not saying everything should be like rainbows and sunshine all the time, because immediately I heard someone who stumbled upon this, not your faithful listener fan base, they're great, but someone who's just well, what do you mean it always has to be hope? We have to be dark. And I like my angst. Thank you very much to whoever's thinking that. But when I get to my end, I would like to be happy. I would like my characters to be, I don't want them to just, not everyone, suffer. And so this goes to a personal point of mine, something you had mentioned earlier, when I decide what media and what content I'm going to take in, and when I look at things like violence, etc., if it's violence just for violence sake or sadness just for sadness sake, I don't want that. I go to things a lot for escapism. I have enough of that in real life. Mm-hmm. But if you give me violence with a purpose, like, and it's not like a gross purpose that I can see something be tracked, and then I get to my end and I see, you know, I need a purpose.
There was a meaning or there was a reason behind the journey that these characters go on, and it turns out in the end. And I'm like a massive hope punk fan. So if you, rather than, you know, in contrast, grim dark, which is like everything is terrible and the world is terrible and it's trying to like hold a mirror up to the world, which is like very Black Mirror. But I am like a massive hope punk. Against all odds, that plucky band of heroes, against all of the odds, they can still succeed and end on, you know, happiness or hope, or, you know, that there is hope for a better tomorrow. And I'm going to be an advocate to the day I die that is the stories that we need. Most importantly, especially to kids, they do not need grim dark. There's a place for horror, and there's a place for dark stories, and there's a place for tragedy.
Yes.
But like, it also creates a sense of cynicism in the society, and we have gotten so far away from Death of the Author, but I do think that it is important to kind of talk about like this desire to always see the darkness in humanity is coming from somewhere. I did want to talk about what is semiotics, just so people understood like what we were talking about before.
Okay, because that also plays into it. So I will track back a little bit. So semiotics is essentially the study of signs and symbols and how they communicate, both, spoken and unspoken. And then a sign is anything that communicates meaning, that's not the sign itself, to the interpreter of the sign. And so one of the examples I really, really liked that I think it might have been on Wikipedia, I'm not sure, is they were talking about like the bourgeoisie and this idea of wine and what does wine communicate. And although like, alcohol and excess is not necessarily like the healthiest thing, for the rich or the upper middle class, wine can be seen as this thing that, oh, but you're comfortable. Oh, but you're healthy. It's like in one way can be seen as this like super destructive, super dark thing. And yet it's also this symbol of status. It's the symbol of comfortability. It's the symbol of all these different things. So that's kind of going back into this, how we create meaning. The other thing about it is that it can be intentional, a specific meaning, or unintentional, which is just like a symptom of it.
Yep. And symbols and meaning of those symbols change all the time. And like as let's think of a Star Wars example of a symbol that sometimes the creators will be like, hey, this symbol means something. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And the audience will not go along for the ride. Right? As an example, what the Skywalker saber means.
Oh my goodness. Literally, I was like, we don't talk about a lightsaber. Skywalker saber.
What does the Skywalker saber mean to you?
Oh my goodness. See, you can hear my actual like outright thought process like in real time. Because I think this was like some Twitter discussions earlier, and I was like, I'm actually gonna think about this. Because wow. Okay, so I told you you're gonna get my thoughts like in real time. So like when I watch the films, depending on who has it, in general. I just, call it that person's saber. So when Anakin has it, I'm like, oh, Anakin's lightsaber, Luke's lightsaber, right? But in general, if I'm going to refer to it, I typically say this legacy saber. And so when I initially think about it, it's when I think about it in context of the prequels, I'm like, this is real sad, because it starts in this like idea of this hopeful place. It's this kid who was a slave who's attempting to be a Jedi, this idea of freedom, but then it slaughters, some younglings and some Tusken Raiders. And this is tragedy to me. And then when I think about it in the original trilogy, I'm like, oh my goodness, it's being used for good things again. There's this idea of hope that this thing can be reborn. And then like it gets lost and we have the green saber, and I'm like, oh, well, that's a thing. And then we get to the sequel trilogy and we've got it with Rey, and Finn uses at one point, and Ben eventually. And I'm like, oh, great. We're not that it hasn't been redeemed, but we're still chugging along with this idea of hope. And then it gets buried, and then I just haven't fully
processed that.
I have not processed that at all. So if you want to help me out, that's okay.
Okay. So in Star Wars, pre-New Hope, it had this feeling of legacy again. It is the gift. It is the only thing that Luke had of his father's, right? Mm-hmm. It was his that connection. Hurts, but yes. In a mythological, symbolic way, it was the key to the gateway to the magical realm. Because when he held that, he has the Force. It was the thing that was allowing him to walk through and to prove his birthright as one of these people that was going to be going on a specialized journey. I don't think that it had the Excalibur meaning until Empire Strikes Back, when he actually pulled it from the snow and kind of proved that he had this like even better mythological powers associated with the Skywalker saber. But yeah, it does. And depending on how you have come into the saga depends on how you view the Skywalker saber, the legacy saber. I always loved that it went to Rey. Yes. I thought that was always like such a powerful and cool moment. And now I literally don't know what to think about it, because I know Anakin and Luke and Leia all hated Tatooine. Like it is a physical representation of both a holy land and a purgatory, and they're like the thing that is tied to their hearts. Like the lightsabers are like literally tied to their owner in a spiritual sense, is now buried in the sands of Tatooine. Like, I cannot think of a worse place to bury them. And they're buried in this like dust ball of a purgatory. I don't understand it. Like, I literally struggle with that symbolic meaning.
I think no, I'm with you. I think part of what makes this struggle so significant is these ideas that have already been ingrained in our heads. And so this is going to come from, once again, someone who got into Star Wars with the sequel trilogy. So, there are plenty of people who were there, in the beginning, OG fans, who were literally learning as it came out and like reforming their, opinions. And so our views are going to be different, because I'm someone who already had all this and all these theories and stuff to come with. But, I think already and I also, so I guess maybe a spoiler alert for, Clone Wars and stuff, like the ending, but you see the color blue, versus this color red. And I think,
that has a symbolic meaning in Star Wars as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's got a symbolic meaning in Star Wars, but also if we forget that we're talking about Star Wars for a second, the color blue and the color red invoke something in people in general. And so then you add in the meaning already, that Star Wars is giving, ignore the fact that Samuel L. Jackson just wanted a purple, like ignore all that. But like to carry a blue saber, who gets to carry a red saber, and what does that mean? And so when I at least get to Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith and all these terrible things are happening with this blue saber, my brain is like getting confused. I'm like, wait, no, but this means something. It's not supposed to mean, what's happening. And so you start to so this rift has formed for me for what I assume this color, which, outside of Star Wars, I'm like calm, tranquil. And inside of Star Wars, I'm like good guy, violence when it's necessary, whether, and that can change based off of your view of who the Jedi are and what their purpose is. And so then you take that meaning, so in my brain, there's a rift. And then you get to the original trilogy, and I absolutely love, because I never even thought about it before, really like that, and the words that you said about, Luke having this thing from his dad. And so that rift is starting to heal and close for me. And that I was like, oh, this thing isn't, what it's happening and what it's used for. And then I remember I take spoilers very seriously. Normally when like a Star Wars, well, I guess I've only really had like 4 Star Wars movies, but when they start to kind of get off to it really, really fast, and I almost like lost my marbles when someone put on my timeline from The Last Jedi when Rey like has Kylo Ren's saber. I saw that and I was like, I'm quitting Twitter for the rest of, and I really did. I don't even remember how long out until we had, but I was just like, why does she have that? What is that? I have to quit Twitter. I need it to be a surprise. And so even then, so that freaked me out when I saw it because I didn't have the context and it was just like a TV spot or something, which marketing, why'd you do that? And I was like, no, that doesn't make sense to me because here's my heroine, here's my why do this means something? Why do you have this? And you are way more of the expert in this than me, but this idea of choosing or not choosing, but getting your kyber crystal, in the sense of the dark side bleeding and all these, like it has this, there's these meanings ingrained in it, which I would also, we talked a little bit about this like kind of off mic, but everyone, we're doing a semiotic analysis at this point. So you're on the ride for one. So we have all of these meanings ingrained, and when that meaning gets switched up and broken, your brain's kind of like, wait, what? No, what does this mean? And so this is all happening with these different sabers, but especially with this legacy saber, this Skywalker saber.
So the best example I can probably give you on a semiotic reversal and how confusing it could be is if you suddenly had a stop sign, traditional hexagon shape red, but instead of saying stop on it, it said go.
Yep.
So when we experience that, there's going to be some dissonance with the symbolic meaning, the culture, and our own experiences feel about that. And that's going to come entirely from how we were raised, what cultures we were raised in. And it's going to come out in weird ways, like Australian readers and listeners of Star Wars and watchers of Star Wars reading Dooku, or listening to Dooku Jedi Lost, or reading the teleplay script, hearing for the first time in canon the word bogan, and in Australian vernacular that actually means kind of like a redneck type person, or like kind of a trashy type person in Australia, and it actually means like a Sith artifact. And that's from the original Star Wars script. He had bogan be like kind of like the boogeyman or something, as representing Sith. It was from that early on in George Lucas's mind. It was like resurrected into modern canon. And so like there's going to be meaning that is implied on things. There's actually a fun example on Twitter. Kevin Scott found out about a word difference, and we actually had quite a long thread of like how these things can be even different, even between UK and North America. So even speaking the same language, you can have completely different meaning applied to the same phrases. So it is very interesting that, some people might view that lightsaber move in context and actually be like, oh my God, there's something happening here. Like the lines are being blurred, but out of context, it could also mean something completely different too.
Yeah.
So,
and that's that, denotation, connotation, denotation's the literal word, connotation is that feeling that's invoking in you. What does it mean to you? And that feeling is your lens for how you're interpreting it. So this idea of myth, when I went over this in class, we never got the chance to talk about myth. But as soon as I saw it in this research, I was like, okay, this is what I want to hear everything you have to say about this. But the particular line that I wanted to put forth to you is he's talking about the relationship between language and power. And he assumes that myth helps to naturalize particular worldviews, which I think is a kind of good encompassing statement from everything that we've been talking about, because it's from our worldviews that we create this meaning, that we see these signs, that we interpret what they mean, that we see, whether it's just the text of Star Wars, A New Hope, or these comics, and then we go, okay, but and so myth is bringing us all together, which I thought was completely appropriate for you.
I absolutely agree in that. And that's why retelling of the mythology with our current cultural text is fundamentally important, because not only does it have to be updated to consider where we're at from a cultural value perspective, but also it needs to tie back to speaking to that lizard portion of our brain that needed heroes to be successful, or needed them to overcome trials, or needed them to go on their journey to understand who they were, so that we ourselves can see that reflected in ourselves, but with the cultural language of our time telling us that story.
I completely agree. The other thing that I wanted to add was how he uses myth, because I thought this ties into what you're saying. And I think when people hear myth, they can think of a couple different things. And so he used the term while analyzing, and so we're keeping in mind his setting, while analyzing popular consumer culture of post-war France in order to reveal that objects were organized into meaningful relationships via narratives that expressed collective cultural values. And so I think that's, it's what you said. It's the time, and it's the cultural values that we have, and then that fully affects the stories that we're going to tell.
And like I've always said, like Star Wars is a reflection of our cultural unconscious, like our collective unconscious, but really it's a reflection of who we are right now. And it's very, very important that we understand that yes, it's a fun story and it's owned by Disney, but the power involved in that is immeasurable. And if Disney/Lucasfilm underestimates that, there's actual cultural ripples that happen. It's not just like, every cultural text is a reflection of the culture that we live in, but this one specifically, because of how it ties into our collective unconscious and how much it has become a fundamental cultural text of our society, you can never escape it. And so like it both reflects, it both speaks to, it speaks for. You have to understand how fundamentally it is baked into us as a culture. And it's not just us, it's globally.
Yes.
Like anywhere with media that has access to Star Wars is affected by Star Wars.
Oh my goodness. Yes. It's I told you I like circles.
Yes.
It's a circle.
And so, okay, where do we go from here? And Roland gets to the point where he's like, don't worry, reader. This is not the end of the conversation. This is this is me empowering you to be aware that how you are viewing the story is important. He calls it the birth of the reader.
Yes. Oh my goodness. The biggest smiles on my face, you guys. Yeah. And I think that's why throughout this whole thing, this whole entire discussion, we've been saying, and I saw it this way and it's valid. And I changed my mind and that's valid. And because you, as the reader, as the audience of this text, are creating meaning.
Yeah. And so like whenever anybody ever questions it, be like, well, my interpretation is through death of the author, and thus screw off, random troll. Like, your value and your worth of the text is your own, and that is what Roland is trying to say. And I agree with it. I like exploring what the creators intended, because I think that they are both consumers of and creators of the Star Wars, because I think that we're going to need a part 2 to this, Gina, at some point, where we actually talk about, again, another facet of the communications. It feels like this is becoming a segment unintentionally, but I love it. But, when you start to think about the added, like as we talked about, the laminated layers of cultural text that are being added onto this, and your layer and your interpretation is just one of those things. It's important to understand that every time that you consume a new aspect of the one story, it's going to change your perspective of the story.
Very much.
So it's a new lens. So think of it almost like, instead of an opaque, laminated cultural thin text, it's actually a clear, but with a slight color to it. And so it's going to always add on top of it. And maybe it's a mosaic, right? So certain areas of that text, you're going to be able to see clearly all the way through to the meaning for you. But sometimes things are going to become muddy because, and we can see that when we have bits of Star Wars that are added to it that make it confusing for us on like what is the valuable meaning to it. But again, it's up to you. You control how you consume the narrative and what it means to you. You're the one who the meaning matters to the most. So you're the reader, the owner of your own interpretation.
Yes. I think the one thing I would like to leave this audience with is, and it's sometimes easier said than done, but don't let anyone make you feel less than, or like you got it wrong, or stupid, or unintelligent for how you read it. How you read it is absolutely 100% important and valuable and valid and valuable. It counts. How you read the text counts. And so that's what I would want everyone to know.
Gina, thank you again for coming on the show. What is your current Twitter handle? Because you change it all the time.
I know I can't have things be the same. So currently, and it will be this for a long time.
I love Twitter for a variety of reasons, but the changing Twitter handles, like I can't find people anywhere. I guess it's kind of like the right to be forgotten, but that's okay. I can survive. But yeah, no, Gina was on our episode back in January where we talked about Marshall McLuhan. The multimedia is the message, but we looked at Star Wars through a lens of Marshall McLuhan. And I would love to have another conversation with you about something related to communications, because this has been like so much fun, as always, to dig into the craziness of Star Wars when you actually try to dissect it from this like lens of a particular stance that somebody was like, I'm just thinking about books here. And we're like, but if you apply it to Star Wars, it's even crazier. Yeah. So thank you again, Gina. It's a pleasure as always.
Thank you.
As always. Thank you again, Gina. It's a pleasure as always. Thank you again, Gina. It's a pleasure as always. Thank you again, Gina. It's a pleasure as always. Thank you again, Gina. It's a pleasure as always. Thank you again, Gina. It's a pleasure as always. Thank you again, Gina. It's a pleasure as always. Thank you again, Gina. It's a pleasure as always. Thank you again, Gina. It's a pleasure as always. Thank you again, Gina. It's a pleasure as always. Thank you again, Gina. It's a pleasure as always. Thank you again, Gina. It's a pleasure as always. Thank you again, Gina. It's a pleasure as always. Thank you again, Gina. It's a pleasure as always. Thank you again, Gina. It's a pleasure as always. Thank you again, Gina. It's a pleasure as always. Thank you aga Thank you for listening to What the Force. I'm Marie-Claire Gould, your host. Our music is the What the Force theme, orchestral music provided by Christy Carew for What the Force. We have a Patreon at patreon.com/whattheforce. We would like to thank all our patrons, especially those who are obsessed and love What the Force: Brad, Cheryl Bell, Melody, Night Huntress, In Wild Space, Susan, Felicia, How Rude, Anna Perez, Macau Mom, Neil, James, Joe Allen, and Christian Luca. Make sure to like and subscribe on YouTube or leave a 5-star review on iTunes or other pod apps. It helps others find the show. You can connect with us on Twitter at What the Force Show, What the Force Podcast on Facebook, or at whattheforce.ca, where we have expanded our content to include reviews, metas, and articles. We also have a Discord. Links are in the liner notes. Feel free to reach out and start a conversation. Cheers.